Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. It's like the turnout for this has just been pretty astounding and also affirming. My name is Mitra Kalita. I'm the co-founder and publisher of Epicenter-NYC and also publisher of The Unmuted, our school's newsletter that comes out every Wednesday and releases video on Friday across social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok. And events like this are also very much a part of the Unmuted mission. Just a little bit of background of kind of what brought us here today. A few weeks ago, we had a webinar called Winning the High School Lottery, Demystifying New York City's New Admissions Process. And in the course of that, both in the questions that we fielded beforehand and the program itself, we received a number of queries about high school admissions for students with disabilities. And a little bit of a confession from my side, I've covered education for much of my career. I spent about 35 years as a mainstream journalist, if you will, and covered education for about 10 of those years. And special ed always came up in the course of reporting, but it was always like one of those over there subjects, right? Like first we have to make sure we serve the mainstream population, and then we'll get to this other thing. And so I confess that when we saw these questions and queries coming over, because of the mission of the Unmuted, which really strives to be your guide to all things New York City public schools and accessing student resources, and really to be approachable and center and serve our communities, this felt like an opportunity that we should not ignore, but really lean into the community guiding us towards doing a part 2 of our Demystifying High School Admissions that does indeed center the community of families with special needs. To kind of co-pilot me on this, I could think of nobody better than Jenn Choi, who I have known for more than, I think, 20 years. We were just talking about this like beforehand. And it's definitely before our kids were born. So that's like, once upon a time for sure, but also those of you who are parents joining us know the bond among friends before you have kids and then you have kids the same age is quite an eternal bond. Also, she is the one of New York City's not just foremost experts on this, but really advocates for children with disabilities. And she's the mom of 2 kids with disabilities, one of whom is already an adult and a high school graduate. And as I mentioned, as an advocate, she helps parents of students with disabilities navigate the special education process in New York City. So thank you, Jenn, for being with us. It's lovely to
Thank you
have
for having me. I'm so excited. Thank you,
you.
Epicenter and the Unmuted. Really, this is
Oh,
great.
it's great. It's a great reunion for us too. And we're both moms in Queens, which is, I think, important part of our identity. And as I mentioned, I'm Mitra Kalita, who founded these media outlets, but also I am the mom of 2 kids, one who has already gone through the high school admissions process and one who will go through this next year. So as I said in our previous webinar, much of this is selfish for me to understand things that I do not purport to understand. Just the format and objectives of today's webinar. And I want to make sure I let you know that automated closed caption can be found on the bottom of your screen as we strive towards accessibility. So do make sure that if you need closed caption, you can turn that on. And in response to some questions that have already come through on the chat, the session will be recorded and will be shared. And we'll send around a link. I understand some of you might need to leave early or are multitasking, as many of us with children do. Totally understandable, but we will be recording and send that around as well. But, the goal really here is to leverage Jenn's expertise in understanding high school admissions for students with disabilities. We will keep the chat open for questions, but I want to make sure that we give Jenn some time to kind of walk us through generally how this works and things for us to be aware of and keep in mind. And then at around 1 o'clock or so, we'll break for questions. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. You can also put it, as I mentioned, in the chat. And the last thing I'll mention is that really this session was almost commanded by all of you into being. And so your feedback does help guide our programming. And so if you have ideas for a part 3 or part 4 or 5 of this, we'd be happy to hear it. Jen on her end, and maybe she'll talk about this later. We've worked with her as she's pioneered surveys in the space of families to better both advocate for your families with special needs, but also, hang on, I'm going to have to turn off my notifications, but also to make sure that we are capturing the complexity and completeness of this story. So we're going to dive right in, Jen. So tell me, the first question really is, how do high school admissions work for families who have special education needs?
Okay, so basically it's supposed to be the exact same way. If you live in New York City and you're eligible to participate in the high school admissions process. The one thing that you have to know is that even though you have an IEP, and I think a lot of parents on this call probably know this, so I'm going to go through this really quickly, is that just because you have an IEP, it doesn't mean that in this particular case that you meet the definition of what is a student with a disability, because you have to have 20% of your educational day, so that doesn't include lunch, that you are being seen by a special education teacher. So that means that you have integrated co-teaching services, or you have special class. Some people call it self-contained class, where everybody in the room has an IEP, or that you have special education teacher support services. Back in our day, we used to call it resource room, but it's you have to have that. Doesn't matter if you have a paraprofessional all day long. It doesn't matter if you have speech all day long. It doesn't matter what. You just have to be with a special education teacher. And so that has to be 20%. So usually, if you want to do the math, usually people have 40 period days per week, 40 period weeks. So, and 5 of those periods are lunch. So that's 35 periods. So 20% would be 7 periods. So if you have 7 periods of ICT or special class or sets, then you meet the 20% usually.
Just to clarify and to put that in like simple terms, just because you have an IEP does not mean that you qualify as an SWD
right,
category for high school
special
admission.
pool of applicants, where almost always the seats per applicant is the seats per applicant is lower, so it's easier to get in.
Now, I'm sure this will come up, but if you have a child with an IEP, is there a case or is there a way to switch from, let's say, below 20% to get into the SWD category?
The only way would be to change your IEP, which is not easy. People do it. And I would never go into an IEP meeting saying, I need to have the 20% now, please give me the 20%. The only reason to change the IEP is because the student needs it. Yeah. And that's why you should change the IEP.
And you allude to the IEP process in New York City Public Schools. I don't want to assume that that's actually not an avenue people might pursue. So can you just explain a little bit about how that works in New York City Public Schools?
Great question. I love talking about it, and I could be here all day, but basically people should know, especially going into high school, that the purpose of the IEP is not so you could graduate. It's not to be on grade level. It is to receive special education and related services so that the student could be prepared for further education, future employment, and independent living, right? So if you're going to high school and you cannot make a to-do list, or you cannot, make an appointment, you cannot wake yourself up to go to school because your mom has to do that all the time, you are at risk for not independent living, right? So even though you have an IQ of 120, but you cannot do your own homework by yourself, and you're graduating from high school, I would say that you weren't getting your IEP services correctly, is what I would say. So like, but a lot of people don't see IEP services that way. So therein lies the problem. But yes, that is the purpose of the IEP.
It sounds like a lot of folks who are joining us in the chat, at least, and speak up if you're not in this category, are in the SWD category. So that gives us kind of a core audience that's joining us for the day. So we've transitioned from IEP to you're in the category of SWD. You qualify in that category for New York City high school admissions. Now what?
So, unfortunately, even though when you go into the student directory, when they were in paper or now they're online, the kind of information that parents need to make choices, it's just not there. It's not in the directory. You can find out what kind of clubs are available. You can find out, what subway is nearby, but you just can't find out the kind of information that we need. We need a lot of information, and the only way is to call. And then, of course, when you call, it's like, who's going to answer the phone? And does that person actually have the correct information? So these are really tough. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of parents recently, sent out emails to superintendents and to the chancellor saying, please ask for special education open houses, because that's a public way of addressing these concerns. Because that's kind of like, oh, I promise, or this is actually a real thing. They have to say, we do this, we don't do this. And so the biggest thing that I ask for parents to do is to call, ask questions, try to get it publicly stated. What is it that they do or don't do? So yeah, I have like a million questions. Well, not a million, but I do have like
I think
favorite
this is
question.
good because again, like I think people want to get right to the which schools are good for my kid, right?
Yes.
And like exactly what the tendency, but you're saying there actually needs to be a step before we go there. So why don't you dive into that a little bit on as you're school shopping, what those questions should be.
Right. So, I mean, it's really hard because number one, so much is dependent on the school leadership. So if the school leadership changes, then I don't really know. I mean, what could happen? So I don't depend on a school name. I depend on a school culture. So you kind of want to see, even if the school leadership changes, at least you know what the teachers are used to. And so the school culture, so you always want to visit the school or, get to know what's happening at the school. So you do want to ask questions. And so I would never want to just look at, what are the names? What are the top names? The only name that I'm willing to give out is one model school. And I only know this because I've been following them for years. And that's Townsend Harris High School. And I feel like they're doing cutting edge special education because they're actually a very rigorous school in itself. And so to do special education in a cutting edge way in a rigorous environment is very new in New York City. And so that's another reason why I look at them as doing cutting edge special education, because the way the funding mechanisms work in our city to provide that kind of service in that type of school, it's not easy. So so when I see that type of activity, I know that there's a commitment, there's a culture. And so I like to look at that particular school as a model. And actually, they're having an open house tonight at the school, tonight at 6 p.m. So even if you're not going there, even if you don't live in Queens, like you should just go and watch what they're talking about, because that is what you should expect. Even if you're not going to a rigorous school, you want to expect that kind of accessibility, that kind of commitment, because we all want to expect accessibility. That's not something that should be a gift.
And is Towson Harris's open house tonight for SWD families only? Okay,
Yes.
so that and in some ways it sounds like you're also saying that they recognize a need for an open house in this way, like is another, when you're saying model school, there's
Yes.
some things that they're flagging that make
Right.
them
They've
so.
been doing they call it instructional support services over there, but they've been doing instructional support services open houses for years now, every year, because they recognize, as some other schools do, but very few, they recognize that there's a lack of information available in directories and elsewhere. And if you know that, then parents would understand, and then they could make the choices themselves.
And I'm putting you on the spot here so I can look up the answer later as well. But Towson Harris, do you know how many applicants per SWD seat they have off the top of your head by chance?
Um, I'm not sure. It could be 4,
Okay, so it's
5.
not as competitive as the
No.
general
I
applicant, but
don't
it,
think
it is
so.
competitive. Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about kind of the competition piece, but one question that's showing up over and over, and I want to make sure that we touch upon is advocacy for your child. So people have called the schools to try to get some answers to these questions. They're not getting responses. Who do they call? You're no stranger to how to advocate for your child. So what are some tips on that front?
Okay. So, regardless of where you go to school, every parent of a student with a disability in a public school should know what an administrator for special education is. We call them AZs, ASE. We call them AZs, but if you and then I could send this later, but there is a directory where you pop in a school name, and then you can find the AZ for that school, and they'll give you an email address. And if you that person is basically in charge of compliance. Like if you worked in a company and there was an HR person, like that would be that person. So they're not your friend. They work for the company, but they still have to watch things. And so if you talk to the AZ and you let them know this is happening, they're not getting back to me, then the AZ might call the school and say, you got to get back to them. But you have to know, if they don't call you back, that's a sign, that either they're not very good at answering the phone, which is not good, or maybe they don't want you there. Maybe you're not that important to them. Maybe answering your question is not important to them. And that's, sadly, that is true. So, you have to sort of weigh like how important it is to you to go there versus, how much do you want to fight when you get there? Because that's okay. You could.
Yeah, I'm feeling for the parent that just left this in the chat, and I want to pick up again. We'll keep going and open up for questions, but this is just a direct like relates to what you're just saying. I have been leaving messages and sending emails after visiting 17 schools. My family is trying to figure which high schools in Brooklyn or Manhattan are serving students with dyslexia while challenging, engaging, and stretching them. What advice would you offer that parent?
Such a great question. So first of all, any student with dyslexia should be welcomed at any school, right? So just because you say, I have dyslexia, they can't say, well, you can't come in. But stretching them, challenging them, how would you know that they would do that? So the first thing is, you have to know how good is their special education, meaning the purpose of special education is not to get somebody on grade level. The purpose of special education is to be able to help them make level the playing field for the students. So you're giving them access and letting them participate. So that's like a big word to a lot of people. Access and participation, that seems like a general word, but in special education, access means that I get to, I get the ladder to get inside the building. And then participation means that if the goal of the lesson was to figure out that 10 dimes equal $1, then I'm walking out of the room knowing that 10 dimes equal $1. And if I have a disability that doesn't allow me to know that 10 dimes equal $1, then I did not get to appropriately participate in that lesson. So somewhere along the line, maybe all I needed was a ladder to walk into the room that lets me know about the 10 dimes. Or maybe I needed to have 10 big dimes to know. Something has to happen, but a school has to know that it's not, I have to tell him 10 dimes. I have to whisper it into his ear 10 dimes, because this parent is worrying about that, challenging him. They have to know that it's access that he needs. It's special instruction that he needs. It is not just the answers. It's not just being allowed to walk into a great school, and so how do you know that the school is good at special education? You have to ask the questions and ask around. That's the tough part.
Yeah, it's a really kind of leveraging the community of each other, I think, is something that
it is so hard, but parents, this is the first thing that I learned when I found out that my son had a disability, is I asked the parents in Queens, and that is it. The best advice that I got when my son was 3 years old was, you have to learn just as much as the teachers. I was like, how am I supposed to know that? I'm a publicist. I don't know anything. But she said, you have to learn. And if you know as much, then you can then talk to them. And so that's how you learn, and I'm sorry that we have to do that, but sometimes that's the best way to be able to understand what they're talking about.
So we're getting some questions on what these acronyms stand for, which I do not want us to take for granted. So I'll just do a quick round robin with you, Jen. IEP?
Individualized educational program. Education program is not plan.
Right.
So it's a contract, right? Like I'm buying a program to watch Mozart, not Beethoven, right? It's not a plan, it's a program.
That's a good way to put it. Mozart and Beethoven. SWD.
Students with disabilities. But
Okay,
that's not like a legal term necessarily. It's just
it's what New York City is using to refer to this category.
In this particular category, right?
Okay. 2E?
Twice exceptional. And it's not a diagnosis, it's just a description.
So on that note, some more questions coming in on, I'm looking for schools that allow for accommodating my child, but also challenge them, similar to what we just heard. It sounds like, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe what I can do is go over some of my favorite questions with the audience. Yeah. And, because, and go over how I asked them, and then go over what kind of answers I'd like to hear.
Go for it.
So I'd like for parents to go to open houses and ask, how long have you been providing integrated co-teaching services at your school? Do not ask, do you offer ICT? Because they'll say, yes, we do. But they're supposed to anyway, right? So it's like saying, do you follow the law? Of course we do. Do you turn on the lights? Of course we do. So how long have you been providing integrated co-teaching services will allow you to understand how long have they been, how experienced are they, right? I've been teaching chemistry for 13 years. You must know something about that then, so how long have you been providing integrated co-teaching services? You can say, what makes your program for serving students with disabilities unique? Right? It's like, whoa, what kind of question is that? It's like, because if they're so used to saying, I turn on the lights here and I give kids a desk and a chair, it's like, if they're looking, I hope And there are going to be some schools that are going to surprise you and say, yeah, we have this, we have that. You didn't know, but we have this thing. I just found out about a school that has a self-contained, I'm sorry, it's called special class, where every week, once a week, there is a transition expert that comes to their class once a week and teaches resume writing, teaches interview skills. I had no idea, and I was one of two parents in that particular special education open house. Maybe that school doesn't know how to market their special education open house, but like, wow, I had no idea they did that. And that is really cool, because that means that that school went out of their way to make that kind of relationship with somebody in the Department of Education to do that. So you never know, but you could ask, because it's a huge bureaucracy. So a lot of strange little things can happen. How does the school monitor progress of students? How often? How do you communicate that? How do you prepare students to participate in their IEP meetings? There's a big push right now, because it is kind of like the law, actually, but there's a big push right now to get students to participate in their IEP meetings. And it's actually like, if schools had a report card, that would be on their report cards. Do students go and sit down and sit in their IEP meetings? All it is like a check, pass, fail. But the truth is, students will sit there, but then they might sit there as if like they're not even there, because they'll start talking about them like they're not even there. And so you want to know, because you're a good customer, you're an educated customer, you want to know, how much time do you spend on preparing students to participate in their IEP meetings? Because seriously, like, this is very, very sensitive information. We're talking about the student's disability. We're talking about how behind they are or how good they are at something. Even talking about how good you are at something is awkward, And so how prepared are they? Do you prepare them? Because a lot of schools do nothing but give them a piece of paper saying you're invited to your own IEP meeting. And then they go to them at the middle of the day and then pull them out of the class and say, come here, sit down. That's all they do in some schools. So you want to know, do you do that or more? So ask them these questions. You want to know who does the scheduling for students with disabilities. Is it someone who knows about the students with disabilities? Like, first of all, you really want to know if there's a special education assistant principal or an instructional support service assistant principal at your school, because you do want a top level person protecting your child.
Jen, when you say scheduling, you mean the scheduling of their classes and
right, the programs, whatever's on their schedule,
okay.
Right? Because, a student with a disability schedule is different from a student without a disability schedule. You have, like, what's on their schedule is a lawful thing, right? So how many people are in the room is the legally, they have to be compliant. And also, it's not even just about compliance. It's like, maybe that teacher is really bad with the students with disabilities. So I'm going to make sure that that child gets geometry with that teacher. Like a really good ISSAP knows that. And if all it takes is, I'm just going to move him there. If that's all it takes, don't you want the ISSAP to be on top of, moving your child's schedule around? If that's all it takes, why leave it up to somebody else? So if you know that your child's assistant principal is the ISSAP and is doing the schedules, that would make you feel better, because that person knows your child. That person knows, not only what's compliant, but like, what are some individual circumstances, that no one knows? Because I'm sure a lot of people in this call have had situations where they've had to call their principal and say, why is this happening? Why did you do this? No one told me. This happens all the time.
Jen, just what does the ISSAP stand for?
Oh, yeah, ISS. A lot of schools in high school do not say special education. They say instructional support services instead.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, keep going. And then I have
Oh, yeah,
another
sure.
She says
Um,
she has to run, so I want to make sure we get
yes,
that in. Go
this
for it.
is one of my new favorite questions. A new question that I have is, what is the average GPA for a student with disability by 11th grade? That is something that you can't look up in the school performance dashboard or anything else that any of the data things that you're looking up. It can't find that anywhere. There are some data points that you can find in terms of like the average students with disabilities algebra 1 scores, students with disabilities global history scores, students with disabilities ELA scores versus the students without disabilities. But you have to remember, there might be a wide range of students with disabilities abilities in a particular school. So you have to be very careful when you're judging that. Some schools, especially if they're big, you're going to have students with lower abilities in terms of academic abilities versus higher. So it's very hard to judge that. But yes, definitely think about that. That's my new favorite question. But another question is, how do you find a student who is not doing well? And what do you do for them? Because a lot of parents they're the flags, they're the monitors. They're going to say, oh, my child's not doing well, can you help him? And you really don't want to do that in high school anymore, because the child will probably already, they don't like it when you do that. And so you want the school to be doing that. I've even gone to my son's high school and said, can you write like a probation letter with your letterhead? I've done that with my own son's school, and said, can you write a probation letter with your letterhead, send it to my son and say he needs to get his act together and you're going to help him with this, because you really want schools to do that, because you need to pull yourself out of the picture, because this is all part of moving towards independent living. So ask schools how they get involved in intervention in terms of academic intervention. What is the threshold, the minimum threshold, and what is the action plan? Is there one even, or is it all depending on you again? Yeah, let's see what else is there. There's just so much fun to think about all these things.
While you're coming up with the next question, which I promise we're going to come back to, one thing I want to make sure we didn't gloss over is in explaining the basics of applications. SWD students fall into the same tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and the lottery system as the general population. Is that correct?
Yes. One thing, so go ahead.
No. So I just wondered if you could dive into the
Yes.
tiers
One
and
thing that I found with parents, one time a parent told me that, they didn't consider a particular school because it was so popular and they thought it was so hard to get into that they never considered that school for their child who had an IEP, who was a student with a disability, who met that 20%. And because they just thought that school was just so hard to get into. And they didn't realize that if they looked really closely and they saw the applicants per seat ratio, then they actually did have a chance. So, if you look at that applicants per seat ratio, even if you're in tier 3, you may not know this, but you might actually have a chance. I'm just not a statistician. I don't know. But there are a lot of parents, if you're looking at those really competitive schools, there's a lot of parents who don't want to send their kids to those schools because some of those schools really do have a lot of homework. And some of those schools, if you've talked to them, you might notice that some of those schools, they don't have a long history of special education provision. They're not very experienced in that. And so the onus will end up being on you to educate them and advocate. And that sucks. Sorry. Yeah, it just does. And that's hard. It's hard for your children to watch you do that too, and but if you hold hands with your children and you say, we're going to do this together, That could be okay too.
Do you want to get back to your list of questions?
Oh gosh,
So then
no,
we can
we're not
open
going
it
to
up.
go through all of them, but
So
like,
if you just the rest of you, while you're thinking of your questions, if you want to unmute Danny, who is running this behind the scenes and very much monitoring chat, you see him in the chat as Epicenter. If you could just alert us to your question, and then he can unmute you in order to ask it. I'm sorry, Jen, go ahead. What were you about to say?
I just noticed something about executive functioning, and I thought maybe I should talk about that for a second because I know a lot of people talk about that. And I want to warn people about overselling. I think a lot of people drop the buzzwords: assistive technology, ADHD, executive functioning, to-do list, planning, organizational skills. And, please, whenever you hear something like that, you must, add more to that discussion and say, please tell me exactly what you have been doing. Always ask what you have been doing and how has that been working? Not what do you do now or what will you do now, but what have you been doing? How long have you been doing that? Where? Because if they've been using a canned executive functioning program, how long? Who made it? Executive functioning, I find that it's like really difficult to teach. It has to be very individualized, and it should be very related to the student's actual work, because the student probably has motivational issues. And so if you're talking about executive functioning and you're not talking about the student's actual work, that's really difficult. And so it's hard to do it well. It's expensive. That's why some of these people who charge a lot of money for it. And so if people are talking about it, you must ask them, past tense, how long have you been doing it? You really, really want to know how they've been doing it so far and where they've been doing it, because many services in school are really just very canned. So integrated co-teaching is always integrated co-teaching for ELA, integrated co-teaching for math, integrated co-teaching for whatever. So where are these teachers going to find time to teach you how to make a to-do list?
Yeah.
How to teach you how to set the alarm clock so that you'll make it to school on time.
Jen, I don't know if you remember this, but I used to commission pieces on executive functioning from you for
Oh,
the workplace. Do you remember this when we were at
oh my
court?
gosh.
And so I actually think this is a really important point. One question that's coming up in the chat: do you know any schools that have good executive functioning plans or programs?
So the only school that I'm following really closely, because I've been studying them, is Townsend Harris. And the reason why I can say that is because I know that they actually have a place and a time where they set the ninth graders with IEPs into a class called advisory. And you don't have to choose, you can choose not to be in there. They don't force you. But that those students actually learn how to read their IEPs, which is huge. I mean, my son goes there. My son came home with a copy of his IEP. I was like, what happened? Why do you have that? That was so bizarre to me. And I've never seen that happen before. And he's like, yeah, we read it in our advisory class. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is so great. That burden is lifted off my shoulders for just one day, that I don't have to do that and someone else is doing that. And it's professional, it's caring, it's the community doing that for my son, not just me. So it's not hush hush, and so they're doing that. They're talking about executive functioning in a group setting. So it's not, but they can still do it individually because there's more than one teacher in the room. There are several students in the room. So it's a really strange, interesting, I've never seen it done anywhere. But
there's
yeah,
some questions
there.
on consortium schools. project-based schools. I know you can't talk about individual schools beyond your own experience, but whether you have seen any trends or anything to mention for students with disabilities at those types of schools.
I think consortium schools have a lot of promise because they're not bound to a test. But at the same time, because it's going to be challenging, that they are bound to a project. And a project is going to require a lot of executive functioning skills. So, I mean, this might be a good time to talk about what's really important to me in terms of getting ready for high school. And while I love talking about the questions and I can go on and on,
Yeah.
what I really hope for parents to do is wherever you go to school, before you graduate from middle school, it's important to make a really good IEP. Like, let's say you're going to a consortium school and you're worried that your student is not going to do well on the project-based assessments because they require so much executive functioning skills, and you're worried that he's just going to be left out in the cold. Then what are the needs? And so you can speak with your 8th grade school team. I'm hoping that the school team will know the student very well by then. And you know, a lot of times when the student's been in that school for a long time, the things that are in the management needs section, sometimes the things that they do for the student is actually not in that section because they know the student so well. So they don't actually write down everything that they do because they know them. So they know the student so well. So they don't write down, like, on Thursdays, I always do this for the student, because they just know, everybody knows, but he needs to have this read to him out loud or he'll just have a tantrum. I don't know, something. So if that's the case, that needs to be on the IEP because that student will no longer be at that school next year. It is a set of directions for us, you know, because he's moving and you don't know where they're going. And so, you know, it's, even though he's moving, he's still moving within the district. The only time when you know, in the United States where, like, they'll go, whoa, this is a new IEP, is when you're moving out of state. Then they'll, you know, want to re-examine you and all of those things. But if you're going to even like Syracuse, they have to follow your IEP exactly the way it's written. So your IEP, you know, you're going maybe from Queens to Queens, you know, so like they have to follow it exactly. The only time when they don't have to follow it exactly is if your middle school has like 11 periods of ELA, and when you go to high school, there's only going to be 5. So, you know, when you get to high school, they'll say, we need an IEP meeting because you have 11 periods of ELA and we only have 5. So we have to make a new IEP meeting. And you will say, no, we do not. We do not need to have an IEP meeting. All we have to do is you give me a waiver amendment where you make 11, you write down 11 goes to 5. That is it. That's it. Because you do not want to have an IEP meeting to make a clerical change. And if they force you, you should complain, call 311, or write to special education at schools.nyc.gov. Because that is something that you do not, you know, having an IEP meeting, an open IEP meeting where there's nothing to talk about but a clerical change is like walking outside in the, you know, in the really cold weather with no jacket, you know.
Yeah,
It's very, very dangerous.
There's a question on that. If I contest my child's IEP now, does the old IEP stand?
If you contest your child's IEP now, so, you know, one of the things that people should remember is that you are a member of the IEP team, but you are not the district representative. So the only thing you're signing is an attendance sheet or a participation sheet. You don't get to decide anything. The only thing is that your thoughts must be considered. So consideration means if you say something, they have to consider you by saying, I hear what you're saying, but the reason why I disagree with you is because of X, Y, and Z. Not considering you is by saying, I hear what you're saying. Thank you. Goodbye. That's not considering you. They have to consider you by saying something back about what you said. So if you contest it, I don't know what that means in terms of what the outcome would be.
The actually, I'll just start to go. We only have 12 minutes left, so I'll actually try to breeze through some more questions. My son is required to learn a foreign language in order to graduate high school. He's struggling. Is there a way language can be waived, or if he takes a computer language, could this count as a foreign language?
I have a feeling that a computer language cannot count, but I'm so glad that this question was asked. So a student needs to have language other than English as a requirement to graduate high school. You need at least 1 year of it to graduate with a basic Regents diploma, and you need, I think, 3 years of it to graduate with an advanced Regents diploma. However, if the IEP team believes, and that's you included, but of course there's one district representative. So if the district representative, after hearing everybody from the IEP team, and this is 8th grade, remember, you can do this in 8th grade. If the district believes that the student has a disability that does not allow the student to learn language other than English appropriately, easily, really hard, that's just preventing them from learning in a way, in a pace that's just too difficult, then the team and the district representative could actually decide to exempt the student from learning a language. So, the only implications that I could see is that maybe when you go to a college, there might be one school out there that says, I really wanted you to be an applicant that had learned a language, but otherwise, like, there's a lot of schools that don't care about that anyway. So, yes, you can ask for a language exemption. It's actually on your IEP. Just look for it. There's like a little checkbox that says yes, no, and your school, your middle school, before you go to high school, because your high school doesn't know you yet. So it's a bad time to ask them. So a lot of times what ends up happening is a student fails, ruins their GPA, and then the school gives them LOTE. Don't do that, And so, ask your middle school. And if they're uncomfortable, then go get help. Find the AZ who probably give them some guidance, because the AZ will probably say, sure, if you feel like the student is not capable, then yes, you can check that little box that says, yes, the student is exempt.
And Jen, what's an LOTE?
LOTE is language other than English, and the AZ is the Administrator for Special Education, ASE. You can call your school right now and say, who is the AZ? Or you can you can email special education at schools.nyc.gov and say, I need to find my AZ right now. Who is it? They will, oh, what if your AZ sucks? Then you have to just ask special education at schools.nyc.gov to handle your problem and say that you've had a problem with your AZ. Can you please handle my problem?
We have another question, and I think I know the answer, but I want to fact check myself. I've been opting my child out of state tests in the past, and now he has 2 Regents classes and highly possible to continue to a Regents-based school. What can we do to prep my SWD child to memorize all the material for a big year-end test and be confident to get an 85 plus? Now, I just want to make sure we're not conflating the tests, your GPA, and any other ways for you to be slotted into tiers in order to qualify for high school admissions.
Well, I don't know if this has anything to do with me. The state tests have nothing to do with admissions process anymore.
That was my gut as well. So I just wanted to make sure, because I think what you just did was give us some really useful strategies for while your kid is in 8th grade, you have a window to tweak some parts of their program right?
Basically, you want to, document the needs of the student while they're with the people who know him the best.
Yeah.
So, there's a thing called management needs, which is an odd name, but it's basically accommodations. And so if the student needs to, bounce a basketball every day before they start the day for 5 minutes, and if that's what has to happen, then that is an accommodation and that must be on the IEP. And if the school does not let the child do that, then they are not compliant with the IEP.
Is there also potential, another question, please talk about reduced homework accommodations and how well does that work in practice for kids with low stamina for homework and who can't tolerate busy work? Is that another outgrowth?
Right. So there's a difference between modification and accommodation. So when you're modifying the curriculum, then so for example, when you take the Regents exam, you cannot modify the Regents exam. You have to take the whole exam. So even if you have a stamina issue, the only thing you could do is maybe take big breaks, or you could take the Regents over 2 days. There's actually a thing called multiple day testing administration where you could take the Regents exam over 2-3 days if you need. You just have to, work it out with your IEP team to make that a testing accommodation. But to reduce the actual test is something that, you can't do that for the Regents. So based on that, can you reduce something in a class? And that would really be dependent on the teacher and what they believe. And so you have to be really careful, and you have to trust, or they have to earn your trust, or vice versa. Because I would be worried if people were to modify my child's curriculum to an extent that I'm not sure anymore that they're getting what they're supposed to get. If you're worried about can they modify, but then you have to wonder how much modification is okay and who's doing it. Because one of the questions that I had before was the ICT teacher, do they have an ICT teacher that's for ELA, but then also for chemistry? And then is this the same person that's also supporting the physics teacher and the pre-calculus teacher? Because I would hate to be that ICT teacher, that special ed teacher. I can't even do any of those stuff, so it's oh my God, so it's really hard to be a really good special education teacher in high school, to the extent where if I ever found one, I'd want to hire that person right away to be a private tutor, because that person would make a lot of money. That's so hard to be a great special education tutor. So I think one thing, and I know we're running out of time, one thing that I want to tell people, because I think people hear this a lot, is you might hear things like, you need to give up ICT if you want to take AP class, or we don't provide ICT in 11th and 12th grade. You might hear, we don't have 15-1 classes. We don't have self-contained classes here. Please know that all of these statements are discriminatory. But you might really be grateful that they told you these things. It's basically what I call self-serve discrimination, because you're listening to these people, and then you can choose if you like their curriculum so much because they're the only school that teaches, I don't know, nail polish, artful nail polishing, because that's super important, and there's a certificate for that. And, and if they're the only school that does that, maybe you'll deal with them, but you at least know going in that that's what you're going to deal with. So it's not a surprise, and you've warned your daughter or your son about that. But, you really want to hear those things, but you have to know that it is a discriminatory statement and they can't say those things to you. But it's kind of a preview as to what you're going to get.
And Jenn, I think as we wind up, we have 2 minutes left. I think that picks up on a point you had wanted to make of the continuation of, in some cases, discriminatory behavior, that a lot of the parents who are joining us have been through this, certainly for elementary school, for middle school, and now they're encountering this for high school. So I wasn't sure if you had thoughts there. And just because I want to make sure that you're able to wrap us up, it feels like the college preparatory aspect of this is a mixed bag. Like some of the families joining us right now might want their kid to go to a 4-year college, others would not. I just don't, I was wondering if entering 9th grade, that also needs to be in a family's mind.
So I think like what I was saying before about the IEP, it's just really important that when you're making those accommodations lists, that you also make challenging goals. Because if you're headed to a school that you think are going to strip away your services, they're going to have a harder time stripping away your services if your child isn't meeting those challenging goals. So the place to set those challenging goals is at a place where they know your student the best. So that IEP that you're making at the end of 8th grade is the most important IEP as you transition to 9th grade. And that might, and how you act in your 9th grade year is going to set the relationship. So if you have to be a big pain in the butt 9th grade, go ahead. Please do it. It helps a lot.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Jenn, in like 30 seconds, is there anything that you want to make sure that you get across that we have not been able to dive into today?
All I can say is just, that I think the parents have been so amazing with all of the advocacy efforts they've been doing, and just if they can just continue to work together and not be afraid and continue to share information with each other, I think we're going to get even further ahead.
Well, thank you for leading the way on that. I just wanted to remind folks who are tuning in that we will be publishing some takeaways. I know there was some interest in Jenn's questions for the schools, which we could certainly put in a list form and publish on our website, as well as circulate to this group. Just a reminder that the Unmuted both publishes on Wednesday as a newsletter, so please subscribe, and also subscribe to our Instagram and TikTok to get those helpful videos on Fridays. This will be uploaded, and this has been recorded to continue. I always say this is the beginning of the discussion, not the end. And I think, judging by the number of questions we got, this group really took it to heart. And my final thank you is to those of you who attended, and to Jenn herself for sharing so much of what you've learned in about 2 decades of advocating for your children, but also for all of ours. So thank you, Jenn.